Self-determination is important to people. It is linked to, if not exactly the same thing as nationalism, right? So on the one hand, what we want to see is how do we give both peoples meaningful self-determination and yet at the same time honor the fact that both peoples are attached to all of the land. I mean, we used to talk about Palestine in quotation marks as being the West Bank and Gaza Strip. My father's family comes from Jaffa, which is right in the middle of what's now Israel, just below and now part of the municipality of Tel Aviv. Until 1948, most of the action socially in Palestine was in what's now Israel. And conversely, the kingdoms of ancient Israel were not in the coastal plain, they were in what they called Judea and Samaria. And so the notion that we can simply disavow our connection to place is really problematic too.
Yo, you made it! My name is Omar Dajani, and I'm honored to welcome you to the Gumcast, where we have deep conversations about the human spirit and what keeps us going despite the shittiness of it all. So, I relate to a lot of these thorny ideas that are around nationalism, and I think it's one of the most important conversations for us to be having these days. And without further ado, my guest and very wholehearted and warm friend, Omar Dajani, is someone who does not just know a lot about the topic from personal experience, as you will see, but he's actually quite the expert. My guest today, Omar Dajani, is a Palestinian American law professor at the University of Pacific McGeorge in Sacramento. He lives right across the bridge from me in San Francisco, California. He's a former member of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and that means he was part of the negotiations support unit in the 90s when Palestine and Israel were trying to negotiate a two-state solution. He pursued that after graduating from the Yale Law School. In this episode, we'll cover everything from his American identity, him discovering his Palestinian identity in a small town in Texas. He invites me to join the ride and asks me about my own Egyptianness, where I reflect on that. We go into the nationalism movements that are happening in America, what is currently a viable solution for the Middle East, and lastly, the effect and impact of loneliness on a new generation. So without further ado, I present you with episode 12 of the Gumcast, Nationalism, with Omar Dajani. Hey, Mr. Dajani.
Mr. Shakir, or should I say Dr. Shakir?
Thanks for reminding me of my credentials. It's a huge part of my identity, which we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely.
And as much as I've tried to shake my identity, that identity off keeps coming back to me. So thanks for reminding me of where I belong.
I'm glad to oblige.
There are so many reasons why I'm really excited about this episode. We've been talking about some of these things. You've been also a huge supporter of this piece of work that we've been doing. So thanks for, giving me the push at a very early stage. And also, this is the very first episode of the second season, which is huge for us. So,
and an honor for me.
We've crossed some kind of chasm there. So, and it's also really good to be doing this in person, where it's also really special that we're doing this in the studio where a lot of the Gumption or Gumcast magic happens.
Emanating from Oakland,
straight from Paul's house. Paul isn't with us, but we're in
Paul
the studio. Paul is with us, very much so. Yes. We are going to be talking about a lot of difficult topics today. How are you feeling? Are you ready?
I'm feeling ready.
Yeah. I know you haven't slept much and you're going through a lot of identity drama in your work.
Right. That's true.
So we're just going to think of this as fuel for the podcast rather than obstacles.
We're going to connect to it.
We're going to connect to it. So, Omar, if I may call you that.
Of course, it's a good name.
It's a great name. Yeah. I mean, it's my favorite name.
One of my friends from college once said, we spend our lives becoming our name. And I guess that means that you and I are moving in the same direction.
Yes. Yes. And you've been moving in that direction slightly more than me.
Yes.
So when it comes to identity, like in our friends group, they've been calling me Baby Omar.
That's right.
Which, sometimes I don't like, but it just shows how much you've been around.
Yes.
Here, too.
I think that all of this is a way of being a little ageist, and I'm not sure how to respond to that, but I'm just going to assume that you associate age with wisdom and take it as a sign of respect.
That's a great assumption. I don't want to lose you in the
Since we're both Capricorns, after all. That also,
too.
Yes.
That too, yes. Yeah. So, yeah, we're covering a lot of identities before we even start.
That's right.
Before we get into the heavy stuff, we start with a story. And that's how we did it throughout season 1, and no reason to change it in season 2. So why don't we start with a story about identity?
As you know, I grew up in East Texas. I was born there. We moved away for 8 years abroad, and then we moved back when I was 8 to a town called Tyler, Texas. Tyler. And Tyler is the rose capital of the world, as I'm sure you know.
Of course.
Yes.
We talk about that all the time.
Well, I mean, it enters most conversations. It is also the buckle on the Bible Belt, a very conservative place politically and religiously. Being someone named Omar, and I was never named Omar, incidentally. I was Omar.
Omar, of
and
course.
In fact, Omar was not an easy proposition growing up. And when I started sprouting hair on my legs, it became even more difficult. And
your genes, I'm sure, sprouted hairs everywhere else.
Yes, indeed. It's funny that you say that because there's this case I teach. So there's this poor guy who goes in for skin graft surgery, and the physician grafts skin from his chest onto his hand. And the guy ends up with a hairy hand, which causes him, it basically destroys his life. He never lives it down. Someone in my class raised her hand and said, well, why didn't they just take the skin from somewhere on the body where hair doesn't grow? And my friend Greg and I, who's Italian, look at each other and we're like, does such a place exist? So there are a lot of people in Texas where such a place existed, not a very hairy place. So coming from Texas, where people didn't think much about ethnic identity, you were either white or you were black or you were Mexican, at least where I grew up. It was a novelty to arrive in Chicago, where I went to college, and find that people very often identified themselves by their ethnicity, that I am an Italian American or I'm 50% Ukrainian. All of this was part of the conversation. I kind of half-heartedly was referring to myself as an Arab American. That was something that my parents and I had talked about. My father's mainly Palestinian, though his mother's family had come from Syria. And my mother was Syrian and French, so we were kind of a hybrid family. And so Arab American seemed like an easy shorthand. This was the way I was vaguely thinking about my identity without much conviction, in part because when cousins from the Middle East would come to visit during my upbringing, I very much tried to downplay their foreignness as a way of fitting in. I found their foreignness off-putting somehow. So I go to college, and that winter, my first year in college, the first Palestinian Intifada erupts. And it erupts in the Gaza Strip. I knew at this juncture almost nothing about Palestine.
Wow.
My folks had told me a little bit about it, my cousins a little bit more, but I had a very, very vague sense of Palestine's history. And so I see it in the headlines and knew just enough to get myself in trouble. And so I saw that there was an article in our college daily that was describing how many Palestinians had been killed in demonstrations in the Gaza Strip. Being, a college freshman, I write, a college freshman letter saying something like, kindly use the active voice instead of the passive voice. Who was doing the killing? Or did they spontaneously combust? Something smart alecky like that. Not really thinking very much about it. But what was extraordinary was the response. There was a flood of letters decrying my criticism of Israel I was mentioned by name, and I learned about this from a Jewish friend of mine at our Hillel chapter on campus, Northwestern, as a voice of anti-Semitism on campus. And then suddenly I get a call from a guy who was at the time president of Northwestern's chapter of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is a lobbying group, challenging me to a debate, one-on-one, no press. And so I think, I better prepare myself for this. And I asked a friend of my father's for suggestions about what I should read. And the more I started reading, the more I became incensed about what I learned. And the more I felt connected to this history that I was just being introduced to. The debate never actually happened because my erstwhile debating partner got mononucleosis. I don't know who he had been kissing, but he left me with something enduring, which is not only knowledge about Palestine, which I started to acquire at that juncture, but a very strong connection, which then became much stronger still when I went to the Middle East that summer for the first time, as the semi-adult one is at age 18. Spent time with my connection with my cousins, who no longer seemed foreign, but instead seemed really interesting to me, fascinating, in places like Cairo and Amman, cities that I didn't know well at that juncture, and found something that felt missing my whole life, a dimension to my identity, which is not to say that I ceased to be American, but I understood better what people meant when they called themselves Italian American, because I had something on the other side of the hyphen now.
So that's interesting. So once you started learning and getting more intimate with that identity, you stopped looking at yourself as an Arab American and more as a Palestinian.
Well, so I definitely began connecting with Palestine, not only as a cause, but also as an identity. And, you know, my family name, Dajani, or Dajani, as I grew up saying it, is a recognizable Palestinian name. And so I started becoming that name, I suppose.
That's very interesting that you grew up in an environment where being more Palestinian was problematic or had some backlash from people that are propagating the idea of, you know, others being anti-Semitic, or almost like the Arab identity becomes that. And I grew up with almost the opposite problem, right? I grew up in Egypt, where it's unheard of to be able to speak in any way fondly about Israelis or Jews at large, but especially Israelis, because I was born to parents that lived through 2 wars with Israel. There is that sense of national pride of, you know, we won the last war of 1973, which after reading is not entirely true either, but it was like this sense that we are different from these people, and therefore connecting with them in any way or fashion was a taboo. It was only when I moved to Boston and had an Israeli roommate who was actually advocating for Israel through a nonprofit that I was able to, you know, be in contact even with anyone from the other side. And it's really funny because even now in Egypt, if you try to talk about Israelis or try to show any compassion towards people on the other side of the pond, it's seen as an attack on your Egyptianness in many ways. And, you know, that comes from a lot of trauma, but it's interesting how we can have the different perspectives just based on where we live, on what it means to be something.
100%. Actually, it's funny. I had a bit of a shared experience of that kind in Egypt. When I was living in Palestine, when I was working there, I went to Egypt to see my sister who was living in Maadi, your old neighborhood at the time, or your Masr Gadida.
I grew up in Masr Gadida, but then Maadi is where I sought to be and lived in 2020.
Okay, all right. So kind of your old neighborhood. I was taking the bus from downtown Cairo to the subway, and it was during Ramadan, so everyone was in a bad mood, and there was a lot of bustling, and I was trying to get off the bus, and I couldn't quite do it. And so this guy very helpfully pulled me off the bus with him. So as we're walking, we kind of chatted a little bit, and my Arabic is really bad. And he asked me where I was from, and I said that I lived in Palestine. And he says, the Jews are terrible. And I said, it's really important, not to see all Jews as terrible, and to, understand that this is a conflict that involves Israelis and Palestinians, and not all Israelis are of one mind. And, I'm trying to, in my bad Arabic, offer this sort of explanation of how complicated it is to think of responsibility in this context. And then he looks at me with some of this new suspicion in his eyes, and he says, "You're Mossad, aren't you? You're Mossad. You're Mossad. You're a Zionist." Then he starts yelling on the Zionist. So yes, I know the dynamic that you grew up in. I was nearly a victim of it.
Apparently, I don't even know the dynamic that I grew up in. And just knowing you, this is hilarious.
yeah, absolutely.
But I mean,
deep suspicion.
Deep suspicion. And in all fairness, it serves you right that you got that response, because you should know better than to visit Egypt during Ramadan.
That's right.
And now it's time for another segment of the Bullshitometer. And so this is basically a bullshitometer device. And it is up to you to use it wisely. And if, I'll ask you a question now, and you can either choose whether it's true or bullshit, and tell us why. And so, use it wisely. It's a very powerful device.
I'm a little scared.
You should be. The question here is that, or the statement that I'll give you, that you can run through the bullshitometer, is that nationalism is always a bad thing. Bullshit.
What we think of as nationalism's worst manifestations are always unpleasant. But to the extent that the nation came into being in our imaginations, because as Benedict Anderson wrote in his classic book, Imagined Communities, which looks at the origins and spread of nationalism, that nations live inside our heads, and they're a composite of different markers of identity. There's this famous line also from Renan, who said, "The essence of a nation is that everyone in it had something in common, and also that we've forgotten what it is." And so it's in part about what's shared, and it's in part about a shared forgetfulness, right? This set of links among people are imagined to serve different purposes. And sometimes they can be imagined to throw off the yoke of an occupation that has been oppressive, which was the case in one of the most important nationalist revolutions of the modern era, which was the Greek Revolution.
Reading or rereading Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, and it's fascinating how he talks about how being an outsider that's trying to get in, so if you're a black person that's starting to play golf and trying to blend in with the white folks, it's sometimes much easier than if you are regarded as an insider that's trying to be out, meaning that if the black community then sees you as someone that's trying to be someone else,
right?
Those national lines that are drawn around color or ethnicity or culture can go a really long way into our psychology and how generally happy or frustrated or anxious we are in the world.
I think that that's so true. And I felt that really strongly when I was living in Palestine. I used to be introduced by Saleh Berakat, who was the chief negotiator. When we would go into a session, he would say, "This is Omar Dajani. His Arabic is terrible."
Exactly.
And, I felt like such an imposter in those moments. here was my own community kind of, somehow casting me out. And I felt it all the more because I wasn't fully a part of that community. I was this American in that setting. And it's hard to kind of navigate in those circumstances because things like language, food, an affinity for certain kinds of art, for certain kinds of jokes, are the things that connect us to people, that make bonds easy to establish. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think about it even with our group of Arab friends here in San Francisco. There is that particular version of dad jokes that Arabs share that creates like a little link, but that of course also excludes, and drawing a line around when identity becomes toxic is difficult.
I grew up Muslim, and when I did the 23andMe, I realized that 5 generations ago I was actually Coptic, and there is some tie between me and in Coptic Egypt that may exist for a lot of Egyptians that are actively trying to exclude Copts. So these lines that were drawn and these identities that were formed, like, they're very temporary compared to the actual line that connects us all to each other, right? As human beings. And some people see a threat in that kind of thinking because they're like, well, we have to protect this identity from external threats, but really we're all the same. Like we've all evolved from Africans who've continued to evolve for millions of years before we started even becoming European or American or Indian.
I think that's right. And I think that very often it's people who have mixed identities that find themselves by necessity trying to bridge the different worlds that they come from. I mean, when I was in law school, I worked at my law school's immigration clinic doing asylum cases. And my very first client was a guy who had been a dissident in the Soviet Union. Yes, I'm old enough to be a contemporary of the Soviet Union.
We established that early on.
Yes, that's right. My being very long in the tooth. But this guy who was an artist and a dissident, and his mother's family were Jewish, his father's family were Armenian. So he came from 2 minorities in the Soviet system who had been discriminated against. For him, that condition of being a hybrid, I think, was central to his art, central to his worldview, and made him someone who saw how artificial these constructs are. And I mean, again, it's not to say that identity is never valuable, but it is always imagined. I mean, to your point about 23andMe, it's always imagined. It's about how we choose to define ourselves.
So, are you up for attempting to solve some of these really big problems here on the podcast? I know you've solved the Middle East problem a long time ago, but
I mean, thanks to me, pretty much there's peace in the Middle East.
It's a walk in the park.
Well, I'm surprised that the Nobel Committee has not seen fit to give me my due.
I think it might have to do with your skin color.
Yes, exactly. Beige.
One of the positive things about nationalism and identity is that we can actually use them to create more peace in the world. And there's this conversation that you had with an Israeli that perhaps a 2-nation state that everyone has been talking about for decades is not necessarily the best way to go, because I don't know, like, in your words, like, how can we use nationalism to create peace in such a tense situation, such as the Middle East?
So, as you know, I've been working for a lot of years on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in one way or another. From my late 20s through my early 30s was based in Palestine and working in the middle of the negotiation process to try to achieve a 2-state solution. The idea of creating to somehow ethnic states, I think was a substantial part of the thinking at that juncture. So as painful as what's happened since is, when you see how remote we are now from any kind of process that could bring us to a negotiated agreement between Palestinians and Israelis, that is painful. What is exciting is that, maybe exciting is overstating it. What's more hopeful is that we've had the space to think anew about what kind of models might work in a place like that. I've been working in writing with my good friend Dalia Shemlin, who is an Israeli survey researcher, looking at whether confederation offers a model for Israel and Palestine. And I won't go on and on about this, I promise, other than to say, because this relates so much to the conversation we're having, it's an effort to try to do two things that used to be regarded as in tension with each other at once. So on the one hand, to really give each people an opportunity for self-determination. And when I say each people, I'm referring to Israeli Jews and Palestinians, recognizing that those are both heterogeneous populations and that there is even a bit of overlap in identity between these categories. And that's something we could talk at great length about if we wanted to. For many Palestinians, it's important to live in a place where you can teach Palestinian history as part of your school's curriculum, where you can teach about the Nakba, the catastrophe, the way Palestinians experienced the catastrophe of 1948, for example, where you can focus on the long-standing links between the people of Palestine and other peoples in the region, our deep connection to the Ottoman Empire, our deep connection to Egypt, our complicated connections with Christianity and Islam, and with Judaism for that matter, to create a curriculum that is ours, right? To tell our story to our kids. So you can see why self-determination is important in a really practical sense. And similarly for Israeli Jews to live in a place where Hebrew is spoken, to live in a place where Jewish holidays are celebrated, where indeed the weekly calendar revolves, or the annual calendar revolves around them rather than treating them as a footnote. Self-determination is important to people, and it is linked to, if not exactly the same thing as nationalism, right? They have a range of links. So on the one hand, what we want to see is, how do we give both peoples meaningful self-determination, and yet at the same time honor the fact that both peoples are attached to all of the land? There's a lot of work being done on this front of different kinds. So for anyone listening, I'd really encourage you to go on the website of A Land for All. And if you just type in Google A Land for All, you'll find it. And this is an attempt to build a movement of Palestinians and Israelis rooted in Palestine and Israel and comprised of people from within Israel, or as Palestinians say, within 1948, and also in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and people further afield from Palestinian communities and Jewish communities all around the world for support. But so there is an attempt to build a movement around this set of principles. And there is also an array of different efforts to put meat on the bones, to really engage the difficult policy questions that this presents. How do you manage security in a context like this? And, there are those who say, oh, it's so idealistic, but people have to remember that we're talking about a space 1/100th the size of Europe. And if Europe, which is effectively a confederation with freedom of movement within most of it, can manage security across all of its space I think the Palestinians and Jews, with our ingenuity, can do the same.
And weapons. I would say would be able to manage their security.
Yeah.
Somehow. And this is probably the second best solution I've heard for the Middle East after the zombie apocalypse.
Yes, exactly. or turning the old city of Jerusalem into a Disney-run property.
Oh, I can get behind that.
Right. I think Disney's found the solution.
Well, now that we've solved all the Middle East problems, let's get back to the very troubled world of America.
Yes.
And, so we're seeing a very polarizing time where America is broken in half. You're either like with or against. And there is like this huge sense of othering, which feels to me that is, very synonymous with earlier times where, we see like this characteristic view or the characteristic image of some sort of demagogue or some sort of very charismatic person shouting at the crowds and, telling them that we're going to crush the enemy and the enemy is the reason for all our problems and like with Germany and like with many other places, there is the call to kind of close up America from the world. And a lot of the movement is fueled by the fear of the other. And I think it's coming from being afraid to understand ourselves. And so there seems to me to be all these barriers now that are being put up behind myths and stories and pseudo-facts. And, there's certainly a darker side to nationalism, which presents itself in this political technology called fascism, which is probably the newest version of, political ideology. It's, as far as I've seen it comes from the word fascismo, which started in Italy with Mussolini, so it only goes back to the 20th century, really. But I think that's where a lot of the people that are isolated and lonely and are crippled by economical downturn are vulnerable to such ideologies. So, people can hate on the previous administration as much as they want, but, what happens when a younger, more energized, more determined version of Trump comes along and mobilizes a lot of people that are feeling lonely and feeling that against themselves or against others in a way that, again, just blinds us from connecting to one another, blinds us from really having any kind of compassion for the others. And so, that's kind of a long-winded way to ask you whether you feel like we might be at danger of a big kind of fascist movement again, or a political agenda that might take advantage of all these people that are feeling isolated by the political system, which I think rightfully so. But do you think that's a danger in this day and age?
I think that we're facing a really dangerous times because the scale of the changes that we are confronted with is so enormous. There's a line, I wish I could remember who said it, that I read years ago, that goes, "It's not so much power that corrupts, but fear, if not absolutely, then beyond the bounds of reason." And I think that fear is what drives a lot of the conspiracy theory that we see proliferating everywhere, where people who feel disempowered and who also feel that the world around them is becoming unfamiliar and scary are looking to explain it in some way, in the way that our forebears turned to religion, which, if you read it, also seems a little far-fetched, right? When you read religious texts, even if you're a believer, the objective truth is that they are, that they take some doing to believe, right? It takes a leap of faith, literally. But I think that these things are natural reactions of people who feel small in a scary and changing world. And I think what is worrying is that as that world gets scarier, people look for structure. And if those who can provide structure are those who offer the easy answers of control and security based upon conformity, then we're in trouble. And when you combine that with technology that is able to do things that even George Orwell wasn't able to imagine, half a century ago, it gets very, very worrying indeed. The thing that keeps me from despairing is that I think we are, particularly in this country, still living in a very decentralized space in a certain way. That what makes American government different than a lot of others is that institutions like the police are very decentralized. They are not run from a single head in Washington. They are not even run from a head in Sacramento. They are locally driven. And when police and judiciary are locally driven, that at least gives you some protection against a central authoritarian power sort of enjoying some resurgence. That's what one hopes, but I think our liberties are frail, and we are seeing in all sorts of places the ways in which governments that had been liberal are becoming decidedly illiberal. And you've got that on a continuum. I mean, Hungary going from liberal to illiberal, Egypt going from illiberal to really fucking illiberal, and a lot of variations on both sides of that continuum.
Yeah.
And so we've got to work at it. And I think as important as the conversation about identity is, this conversation about identity sometimes maybe distracts us from the need to confront the broader threats that we face.
Yeah, so we dove into a lot of deep ends there. The world does seem like a very troubled place. We know that it's very lonely, especially when it comes to younger people right now that are maybe just joining the workforce. It's a very weird time to be joining the workforce. And especially with all the messages that they're getting from social media about how inadequate they may be, it's really troubling to think about the amount of loneliness and fear that's in the world right now. So in order to attempt to end on a high note, how can we, what's the work that we need to do to maybe transmute some of that fear into love, to accept each other a little bit more?
Well, I think that you had hit the nail on the head when you referred to loneliness. I brought the then president or prime minister of the Palestinian Authority to come speak here in California some years ago, and he was talking about the separation wall that the Israelis were building between Palestinian cities in the West Bank and Israel. And he said something that I didn't know. Maybe you can confirm that this is so. He said that in Arabic, we don't say, as we do in English, absence makes the heart grow fonder. We say absence makes the heart grow colder. Is that true?
Yeah. بعيد عن العين بعيد عن القلب.
Outside of heart. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that's striking to me, I mean, just having finished this study looking at governance models for the Middle East region, is how important the local is. I think the local is our ticket to ride somehow. It's where we can meet people. It's where we can transgress boundaries. It's where we're able to see others as the complex beings that they are, rather than as a caricature. I mean, I am grateful to have grown up in East Texas in this respect, because I know that even though my politics are very different than those of many people I grew up with, that I still have a strong conviction of their goodness, those people. And it enables me to know that there are people outside of the Bay Area who are virtuous and have good intentions. But I think that we lose something by how segregated we are politically and otherwise. To the extent that people, I think, can actually step into their communities, into civic associations, into volunteering so that they are face-to-face with people who are really different from themselves, having conversations with people whose politics are different than theirs, seeking out contexts where they can have those conversations. And that doesn't mean on Facebook. I think that when we don't separate ourselves, when we actually sit face-to-face, as you and I are doing right now, it becomes possible for all sorts of things to be overcome.
That's a great note to end on, man. I really hope more people are having face-to-face conversations in the world now. I hope we can recover from a lot of this loneliness and start getting others that we may, hate their caricatures, and start seeing that our edge as human beings is with who we do not have everything in common with. And, I hope more and more people are able to have conversations that trigger them, because that trigger is really where healing starts, I think. And that's one of the things that we're trying to push with the podcast of, knowing the other, but also first knowing ourselves so that we can connect with the other. And we try to isolate ourselves from anyone that has a different opinion, which is happening now. We're never going to heal, and the trauma is just going to keep making things wider. So thanks for your time. And on behalf of myself and Paul, we were both very excited, and rightfully so, to have you, knowing you as a friend, but also with everything you bring. And this episode has certainly been one where I learned a lot. I learned a lot about my own culture too, and about other cultures that I did not know much about. So thanks for everything you brought, man. This was awesome.
Thank you. And I'm glad that we were able to both become Omar a little together.
Whew. What an episode to start season 2 with, right? Sometimes if you have enough gumption, you might as well just go all the way. I hope you enjoyed this episode and related to some parts of it. And I encourage you to join us on the Substack if you subscribe at gumption.world, gumption.world. You can find extra sound bites that I've excluded from the original podcast, where we cover some of our thoughts on what is going on in Germany with Merkel and refugees. Omar covers the difference between civic and ethnic nationalism. We talk about identities in Syria and Egypt, more about a land for all. And finally, we also talk about QAnon, a fascinating phenomenon that's spreading throughout the world. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you engage with us on the comments, on the threads. You can also join the Gum Chat and our Zoom calls if you subscribe. And finally, I wish you a great start to the year. Next episode is going to be number 13 with our relationship to gender identities. And I'll be having an incredible woman join me and tell us about her interaction with sexual harassment in Egypt, and a fascinating way about how she deals with it and how she regains her power as a woman. And I think every gender around the world can benefit from listening to that. So stay tuned, and I'll see you then. Season 2 of the Gumcast is brought to you by Mustafa Al-Azabi on audio engineering and music leveling, Kiva Schweg on audio trimming and music selection, yours truly, Omar Shaker, on story and content creation. Very special thanks and gratitude go out to Paul Kist, who produced Season 1 and gave the Gumcast its voice, and the one and only Omar Al-Deeb, whose expertise and advice on music production keeps us performing on a top level. Thank you all for listening, and see you next episode.